I'm going to give you a very short version of how do we think about where should we spend money and do the most good. So I'd like to talk to you about how do we stop wasting trillions? How do we start thinking about where can we spend resources and do the most good? This is what I do for a living every day. You may have heard about a lot of the stuff that I talk about also in The Australian about climate. But in some sense, it's just a little tail end of the whole conversation about what are smart things to do. When we look across a wide range of areas and look at what's smart, we also find some things that are not smart. And unfortunately, a lot of the climate impacts, not all of them, a lot of the climate policies that we look at are not very smart. Unfortunately, when you talk to most Western countries, they don't really want to hear about all the things that are really smart. They just want to hear about the dumb things. So that's why a lot of people mostly think of what I say and what the Copenhagen Consensus says as if it was about climate. But it really is much, much more. So let me just talk a little bit about the world. So there are lots of challenges. And the amazing thing is there's also a lot of really good solutions. But what is it that gets most of our attention? Well, if you look at it, it's very obvious that most things that get our attention are the things that have the cutest animals, or the most crying babies, or the groups with the best PR. And surely that's not how we should be prioritizing. What we try to say is we should prioritize by knowing what works and what doesn't. For every dollar spent, where do you do the most good? That's where you use menus with prices. This is sort of a standard menu, right? Oh, cool, I can make my own pizza and it costs $9.99. I know what I'm getting. I know how much I have to pay. Imagine if this was your menu. Imagine if there are no prices. Unless you're really wealthy or on a good expense account, you won't know whether the real price of that pizza is 99 cents or if it's $1,000. Also, you won't know whether you're actually getting the world's smallest pizza or a really, really large pizza that'll serve pretty much your whole company and then some. Right? The whole idea here is to say you need to know how much you're going to pay and how much good is it going to do. That's what my organization, the Copenhagen Consensus, has been doing. We've been making menus for the world, really, for 16 years to ask, where does the next dollar do the most good? We don't look back in time and say, did people screw up in the past? We look at where can you spend the next dollar and do the most good. We work with more than 300 of the world's top economists with 7 Nobel Laureates in economics, and we really done this across a wide range of areas. We've done this in Haiti, in Bangladesh, in India. We're right now working with Ghana. We've tried to help the UN set targets, and I'm going to talk a little bit both about Haiti and the UN. We've also tried to look at climate, health, and HIV, and I'm sure some of the questions later on are probably going to be about climate. But let me just ask you, so we basically try to help governments, so DFAT here in Australia, and philanthropists to think about where should you spend money. I gave a presentation to the giving pledgers, so Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and all the others. They meet up once, the guys who promised to give away at least half of their wealth, and they're billionaires. And I gave them, I asked them this question that I'm going to ask you now. I gave them a couple of opportunities, and then I said, where would you spend $1 million first to do the most good? And I'm going to ask you exactly the same question. You won't have enough information, but it'll be a good sort of sense of why you need to know about how you think about priorities. So I'm going to give you 3 different proposals that we did for Haiti. We were asked by the Canadian government to look at where can you spend money in Haiti and do the most good. They wanted to know because they have spent, and they've been very open about this, we've spent $1 billion, they say, since the earthquake in 2010, and we can't tell the difference. We can't tell that it's actually had an impact in Haiti. We would really like there to be an impact, and that's why we want to find out what are smart things to do. So I'm going to give you 3 possibilities, and afterwards I'm going to ask you, where would you spend $1 million to save the most lives? So the first one would be, let's build urban sanitation. So this is Landa. She's 9-year-old. She's walking through the mud in Cité du Soleil in Port-au-Prince. Clearly, this is not what a 9-year-old girl should be living in. Clearly, the lack of urban sanitation is a huge problem. About 3,000 people die, we estimate, across Haiti. And if we built urban sanitation, we could probably not save everyone, but we could certainly save some of these people. So the first option is, should you be investing more in urban sanitation? Another opportunity would be to focus on the immense amount of accidents that happen. Most developing countries are really, really dangerous. About 1 in 10 people who die from violent deaths. So accidents, stabbings, falls, injuries that you get burnt in, and all kinds of other things. Maybe the right way would be to try and train first responders. If you train first responders, at least those people who are likely to die otherwise will have a better chance to get to a hospital and hence survive. Maybe that's where you should be spending your resources. The third thing, as you may have heard, right after the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, we got cholera. Ironically, the UN brought in cholera with some of the peacekeeping forces. And this is an entirely preventable disease. So we've had almost 1 million people suffering from cholera, and about 10,000 people died from cholera. It's entirely preventable. We know how to do it. It's just simply a vaccine. So maybe we should be spending that $1 million on vaccines. It's not going to be enough to cover all of Haiti, but it would certainly help a lot. So those are the 3 things that I want you to think about. Where would you spend your resources? So you can spend it on build urban sanitation, or train first responders, or vaccinate against cholera. Can I just, and I know you don't have enough information, and if you were actually going to spend $1 million, you'd probably look a little bit more into it. There's no questions now because I need to run through this, but I'll get back to it. If you do this, where would you spend your $1 million? So just show a hand, who would spend it on build urban sanitation? That's a very large part of the room. Who would spend it on train first responders? And, well, that's a very small part. I think it's 0, right? Maybe a little one. And then vaccinate against cholera. All right. You guys are just as smart as the billionaires. They voted pretty much this way. It's like 70-30 or 80-20, and then nothing to the middle. Let me just show you what the results show. Of course, I've picked these also to startle you a little bit, right? If you build urban sanitation, you will do good. Your $1 million will save 7 people from dying every year. That's good. That's great. That's 7 people who would otherwise not have died. Sorry, who otherwise would have died. But had you focused on cholera, you would have saved 50 people from dying every year. And if you spent your $1 million on trained first responders, you would have saved 550 people. The whole point here is to say, we are very likely to guide ourselves from things we already think we know, from the cute pictures. We want to save land, right? But the idea here is to say, if we actually want to do good, we need to ask, how much good will this do? And there's a lot of reasons why, and we can talk about that afterwards. But the whole idea is to get data back into this conversation. So that's what I really want to show you. The UN did both amazing and frustrating, as is often the case with the UN, a priority setting process to take over from the Millennium Development Goals, which they did back in 2000. They wanted to do it again in 2015. They set what eventually ended up being known as the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals have been signed up by all countries around the world, so Australia is also signed up to it. And it basically says all good things for everyone. I went around and met with a lot of the UN ambassadors who were setting up these targets, and I pleaded with them, look, we're going to do a cost-benefit analysis of all these targets. You should be focusing on the smartest targets. And they were all like, yes, that's really, really smart. But of course, it turned out that this was not actually what the UN ambassadors were playing. They were not playing the game of how do we make the best targets for the world. They were playing the game of saying, I'm the Norwegian ambassador. I can make fun of the Norwegians. I want to get my government's 4 targets into the final document. And likewise with Brazilian ambassador, he wanted to get Brazil's 5 targets in there. And on and on. That's why we ended up with not a few smart targets, but actually 169 targets for the world. We basically promised everything to everyone, everywhere, all the time. Not surprisingly, the world can't afford to do all of these targets. So fundamentally, we've just promised something that we know is going to end up making everyone disappointed by 2030. We tried to look at where should you be spending resources. We worked with a lot of economists. These are all the different papers. They're all available on our website. We published a big Cambridge University Press book across all of these areas. This is all cost-benefit analyses. But actually in front of you, you have the folder, which is just a one-page that tells you what the work of 50 economists, 2 years of their lives, several Nobel Laureates. They're all really annoyed that all of their work can be distilled into one sheet. But this is how you get people's attention, right? The idea here is to say, out on the left-hand side are all the different targets. And for each one of these targets, there is a cost-benefit analysis. And what the bar out to the right shows, am I doing this right? Yes, sorry, I'm really bad with left and right. Out to the right, the bars simply show you how good is each one of these interventions. If it's a long bar, it's good. If it's a short bar, not so good. It basically shows you how many dollars of social good do you do for every dollar spent. And that's what I want to show you a little bit about. So I'm just going to show you up here. This is the same thing as what you just saw. But basically, this is all the research. Obviously, I can't go through all of it, but I want to show you a few of these, why it is that the world ought to be focusing on some things and not other things. So let me just start off. If you look down at the bottom, governance and institutions, a lot of people point out, look, one of the most important things is to get governance right, is to make sure you don't have corruption. The problem, and the reason why it ends up in the bottom, is we don't know how to translate dollars into good institutions. We know they're important, but we don't know how to do it. And so if there's things you don't know how to do, and there are things you do know how to do, and I'm going to show you a lot of those, you should do the things you do know how to do first. There's lots of other things. For instance, poverty. Poverty is a huge problem in the world. But attacking it directly, basically trying to give people money, turns out to not be a very effective way. On the other hand, there's a lot of indirect ways, like getting better education or getting better nutrition, I'll show you that in a bit, that works a lot better. If you look at water and sanitation, surprisingly not very good. This is one of the things, this is one of the reasons why Landa from Haiti was not a very good intervention, because toilets cost a lot to build. And people often don't use them unless you spend a lot of money to keep them nice. And even then, they'll lie about it. We put up counters in India, and then we asked everyone, so how do you use the toilet? And everybody said yes. And we could see only about half was not lying when we looked at the counters. The point is, it's really costly to do something about sanitation. So if you look at this one estimate, I'm just going to give you the very brief overview, right? Lack of sanitation kills a lot of people around the world, 250,000 people. But if you do simple sanitation, that is basically a hole in the ground. Has everyone finished? Basically a hole in the ground, right? It doesn't help you all that much. And it costs quite a bit. We estimate it'll cost $31 billion every year. The main benefit will actually mostly be that you spend less time, you waste less time. You'll also get some mortality and disease benefits. Overall, we estimate the total impact of that is about $91 billion. So you do good, but only some good. We estimate the benefit-cost ratio, and I'm going to say that a lot, is 3, right? So for every dollar you spend, you do $3 worth of good. That's nice. That's why those bars are fairly small. And that's why I would argue we should try to go for something that's much, much better. Let me just show you climate. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm sure we can have some Q&A afterwards. But if you look at climate, it then ends up fairly far down. And for the simple reason that it's really hard to spend money here and do a lot of good. If you look at the 2-degree target, which is what everyone says that they've signed up to, we actually have analysis of the 2-degree target. So William Nordhaus, one of the leading climate economists in the world, he's the only person to win the Nobel Prize in economics from climate. And his model shows, sure, if you do the 2-degree target, there will be a significant benefit because you'll have less global warming, hence less problems from global warming. The total benefit across the next centuries is probably about $100 trillion. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of good you do. The problem is getting to the 2-degree target will cost you about $350 trillion. It's a bad deal, I don't need to say, but let's just say it anyway, right? It's a bad deal to spend $350 trillion to do $100 trillion of good. Every dollar you spend will do 29 cents of good. When there's so many other things you can do, let's perhaps do those instead. And one of the things I've kept pointing out, also in the Australian and many other places, is it turns out if we focus on green energy R&D instead, because it's so much cheaper, and because the idea here is if you can innovate green energy to be cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone will switch, not just rich, well-meaning Australians, but also the Chinese and the Indians and everybody else. It costs less and it has much greater benefits. We estimate over the century this would cost about 1.6 trillion, but the benefits would be in the order of $18 trillion of avoided climate damage. So the idea here is if you spend it on investment in green energy R&D, every dollar will do $11 of good. So you can just simply see through your sheet how well does this work. And you can simply shop and say, which ones do I want to do? I'm just going to rush through because I'm very well aware that we have lots of other things we want to talk about. So energy, there are lots of smart things you can do. For instance, get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, especially in places like Venezuela, where I don't know yet anymore, but it used to be that gasoline, for instance, was subsidized 92%. So yeah, you could basically ride around. If you were lucky enough to be rich enough to actually have a car, then you could ride around, but obviously that's not a very effective way to deal with these issues. Conflict and violence, I think one of the big overlooked problems in the world is that there's an enormous amount of violence against especially women and children. So UN numbers seems to indicate that every year 308 million women are attacked in a way, in domestic violence, attacked in a way that would mean that the person who did it would go to jail in the US. 308 million women. We estimate the total cost of that is $4.4 trillion, or about 5% of global GDP. It's a huge issue, but it's also true for children. We estimate that every month, 290 million kids are hit so badly, again, that you would go to jail for this in the US. It actually turns out in some of these surveys, they're horrible reading. It turns out that a fourth of all these beatings of children only stop when the implement with which they're beaten breaks. Yeah, it's just phenomenal, right? And this, we estimate, costs $3.6 trillion every year. So again, there are lots of good things to be done, things that don't make the headlines, but just happen to be incredibly important. Let me just give you a few things on biodiversity, for instance. There's lots of stupid things to do in biodiversity, but there's also some really, really good things. And one of them is, for instance, to stop to half coral reef loss. Basically get people to stop dynamite fishing, cyanide fishing. Not only does it help the biodiversity, but it also means you get better fisheries because coral reefs act as hatcheries, and you also get more tourism. For every dollar spent, you'll probably enjoy about $24 worth of good. Education, a big issue, and I'm sure we can come back to it. It turns out that it's really hard to do money into good education. For a variety of reasons. For instance, in India, they have really, really bad teachers. What they've done is basically they've hired almost 7 million teachers. They've given really good wages. They're almost impossible to fire, so they rarely show up. So the solution to India right now is that you actually hire a second set of teachers to come and do what the first set should be doing. And it turns out to be a pretty good deal. The danger is that eventually these guys will also get permanent and then they'll stop showing up, and then you need to hire a third set of teachers. But you see the problem, right? And so it turns out that it's actually quite hard to get good solutions for education directly, but I'm going to show you one of the very, very good indirect ways, which is nutrition. So it turns out that nutrition is one of the best investments in the world. Why is that? It turns out that if you invest in nutrition for really small kids, 0 to 2-year-olds, it develops their brain better so that when they go to school, even if it's a crappy school, and it likely will be, they will learn much more. So when they come out, they'll become much more productive, and so in their adult lives, they will make much more resources. This has actually turned out to be true. This used to, for a long time, be a conjecture. It generated several Nobel Prizes, but it was a conjecture. Turns out that we actually have the world's longest running study from Guatemala. Back in the late 1960s, American researchers went to Guatemala and picked out 2 small villages, rural villages in Guatemala, and gave the kids good food. Now, you can hear where this is heading, right? Because they picked 2 other rural villages right nearby, and they basically get the kids their sugar water. But you'd never get this past any sort of ethics committee today. But our people went back and refound those kids. They're now in their late 30s, early 40s in Guatemala. And the difference between the kids who are well-fed and not well-fed is amazing. So for the kids who are well-fed, they're much likely to have happier marriages, better jobs. If they're women, they have fewer miscarriages. But crucially, it turned out that they have, if they avoided being stunted, which is one of the best indicators of not having been fed well, they had 60% higher wages. They're just simply much, much better, more productive. So get more food to small kids. It turns out the average cost across the world would be about $100 over 2 years. The benefit would be just measured in how much more productive would you become in percentage-wise is almost $4,400, or for every dollar spent, you'll do $45 worth of good. One of the best investments in the world. Why is it we're not focusing more on this? This is the kind of way that we would make everyone become much more productive in the long run. I'm just going to show you a few more things and then I'll shut up. On tuberculosis, it strikes me it's amazing that we know almost nothing about tuberculosis. Remember, tuberculosis over the last 200 years killed 1 billion people. It's probably the biggest disease killer, certainly over the last centuries. A lot of the famous people you remember from 100 years ago died from consumption or tuberculosis, right? But we fixed it. And so we don't really care about it anymore. Yet it's a huge problem in most places around the world. So tuberculosis is actually the most killing infectious disease, not HIV and malaria, partly because we fixed much of both HIV and malaria, but we've given no attention to tuberculosis. It turns out it's an incredibly good investment and very, very easy. So very roughly, we could save almost everyone. So we could save about 1.5 million people dying from tuberculosis every year for about $8 billion. These are all US dollars, I should say. $8.1 billion annually. The benefit would be, and this is crucial because most of these tuberculosis kills people in their prime. It kills moms and dads who've already taken their education. They're now moms and dads. They're productive. Then they die, leave their kids. If we did something about that, it would at least generate 20 more life years on average. The median benefit would be about $38,000. The cost per tuberculosis case is just $900. So we would actually get a benefit cost ratio of 43. Every time you spend $1 on TB, you do $43 worth of good for the world. Let me just show you the 2 top things, and then I'll end. On gender, if you look at universal access to contraception, is an amazing achievement. Why is that? Family planning, basically because it generates an enormous amount of benefits, both for moms and kids, but also for the global economy. So about 215 million women don't have access to family planning. If we manage to get that, the cost would be about $3.6 billion a year. But the benefit would both be that a lot of moms wouldn't die in childbirth. So we estimate about 150,000 moms wouldn't die in childbirth. But because you get access to family planning, you also space your kids better. That means you don't get them when it's really inconvenient right before the harvest, for instance. It means that you can invest more in them. It means that there's much less likelihood that they'll actually die. That's why we estimate almost 640,000 kids won't die. So that alone, of course, it also means that about 600,000 children won't lose their moms. The total net benefit of that is about $145 billion a year. But that's only about a third of the total benefit, because if you get better family planning, you also get fewer kids, because you space them better and then eventually you run out of time. So you get fewer kids. That means they have more capital, they get more investment both from parents, but also get more investment in the sense that there's more capital left over for them. That means they become more productive. We know that that's sort of essentially what happened on a juiced up version in China. The demographic dividend, that you simply get slightly higher growth. We estimate that benefit would be worth another almost $300 billion a year. So for $3.6 billion, we could make the world almost $450 billion better off. Or every dollar spent would do $120 worth of good. The last, and perhaps most important point, is just simply free trade. We seem to have forgotten that. That just happens to be incredibly effective. So if we actually did free trade, do you guys remember the Doha round? Politicians gave up on that. We talk incessantly about Kyoto and Paris, but nobody seems to be talking about how the Doha round could make an amazing achievement. So this is not even free trade, it's freer trade. If we managed to do the Doha round, we estimate the total cost would be about $250 billion. That would mainly be bribing rich Western farmers, right? Because that's basically what was holding back the Doha round. But if you run the World Bank's dynamic models and how much better off would the world economy be, in total, the benefit would be in the order of $500 trillion. We estimate the average person would be, in the developing world, about $1,000 richer by 2030. This would be the amazing gift that we could give people. We promised in the world with the SDGs that we're going to do a lot of good for 2030, but we don't have the money for it, and we're going to end up disappointing most people. Why is it we don't actually focus on making sure that the most effective thing, which is free trade, would actually help them become $1,000 richer per person per year in 2030? It would lift 160 million people out of poverty. And for every dollar we spent, we'd do $2,000 worth of good. The important point, and this is the last slide, the important point is, if we spend, and we're likely to spend just simply through DFAT and other similar institutions, USAID in the US and everywhere else, we're going to spend about $2.5 trillion just in public development aid over the next 15 years. This money will do good. It will not do an amazing amount of good, but it will do good. We estimate it'll probably in total do about $17.5 trillion of good. But if we spent this in the best possible way, in those things that I've just shown you, the things we know work best, we could do so much more good. We could do more than 4 times more good. Imagine that for Australia. That means that the money you spend on DFAT, you wouldn't have to give more. You would simply have to spend it smarter. We could end up doing $80 trillion of good globally instead of just a measly $17.5 trillion. Every year, the world spends about $200 billion. That's both from public spending and private philanthropy. We could increase that by 4 times. I think that's just so amazing that we don't have this conversation. And so again, our goal here really is, I recognize that putting out this sort of menu, it's very easy to say, why aren't we all listening to this? And of course, the real issue is that there's a lot of vested interests in some of these things. So I'm not going to argue we should be all smart. Imagine if we were just 1% smarter. Imagine if instead of wasting 100%, we just wasted 99%. Then we'd still do 50 billion more good for the world. So if we can get this message out, and that was really the point of these where I asked you to choose, right? If we can get the point out of don't look at who has the cutest animal or the most crying babies or the groups with the best PR, but instead look at who actually has the best cost-benefit analysis, we could help make the world $50 billion better off. How cool is that? Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. And just a footnote to Bjorn's excellent presentation, the Doha multilateral round that collapsed, I think it was in the northern summer of 2008 on the eve of the global financial shock in September of that year. Many economists attribute the sluggish economic recovery since the financial crisis to the failure of political leaders to kickstart multilateral free trade. Now it's time for Q&A, and our first question comes from Doug Bandow. Doug?
The question is, how can we help intelligent activists, intelligent people get through this superheated political debate and get good information and actually understand what the threats are of climate change and what the analysis is? Because obviously we have the deniers, we have those who believe doom is upon us. How can an average person try to figure this out, who to listen to, how to make a decision?
So I think there's a lot of good part questions in that, and let me just try and answer a few of them. So fundamentally, I think there's a couple of things that we need to get through. So when I presented this to the World Resources Institute, they were like, how dare you make it red? How dare you make it less than 1? And they were sort of like, look, doing 2-degree target is at least 1.3 or something. So instead of being a complete waste of money, it's only just not very good. So I think a lot of people in the very green part of the conversation still knows it's not a very good investment. And I think that's where we get the point of saying, why is it you insist on helping people in 100 years really ineffectively with huge sums of money instead of helping them right now? If you ask them, what do you care about? When you ask people in the developing world, they don't answer, yes, I worry a lot about 2 or 3 degrees temperature rise in 100 years. They worry about the fact that their kid might die tonight from malaria. And I think that is one of the sort of emotional ways. This is nothing to do with the cost-benefit analysis, but the emotional way of saying, how dare you, sorry, this sounds like I'm impersonating someone else, but to actually focus on helping them inefficiently in 80 or 100 years rather than helping them tonight. So that's one part of it. The second part is, and this is of course their backup argument, is, well, if you don't do this, nothing else matters. The whole earth is going to be ruined. And I think that is probably the biggest part of this conversation, that you just simply have to roll it back and say, that's just not true. It's not what the UN climate panel tells us. It's not what all of the analysis show us. And it's not what the data show us either. If you look at how many people died from climate-related disasters in the world 100 years ago, so in the 1920s, the answer is about 500,000 people died every year. Today, that number is down to about 18,000 people per year. We've literally seen a decline of 96% death. And remember, at the same time, we've become 4 times more. So we've actually seen a per person risk decline by 99%. Why is that? It's mostly not anything to do with climate, but everything to do with the fact that if you're rich, you don't die from climate-related diseases. If you're poor, sorry, not diseases, but problems, if you're poor, you do. And so, again, what is the best way to help most of the world? It's to make sure that they're not poor. It's right. Do you guys remember there's a hurricane that hit Tacloban in the Philippines back in 2013? It happened right when there was a UN climate summit, and everybody was saying, oh, we should help those people by cutting a ton of carbon dioxide. I'm not going to go in my car tomorrow and help them. And you're like, really? A similar hurricane hit 100 years before, killed 40 times more people. Why? Because they were incredibly poor. Now they're only very poor. But of course, the point should be that we would want to take them out of their corrugated roofs and into good homes. So the idea here is, again, to point out to people, how do you help people to do much more good? And the same thing, if you look at total global catastrophe cost, we only have good data from 1990, but the linear trend is it's gone from costing 0.26% of GDP to now 0.18%. So it's not only gone down, but also it's 0 point something. It's not the major part of the reason why the world has problems. The reason why you think so is because you watch too much CNN.
I'm interested to know how you're measuring social goods, maybe just for some examples, so, and how you're measuring spending. And the reason, I guess, is we've spent a bit of time looking at how there's a ton of money spent in Australia on Aboriginal poverty and closing the gap and other things. And when you look into it, a lot of that actually doesn't get spent particularly on that. It'll get spent on some public servant somewhere who then writes a report and does this. So you could spend $1 billion on contraception and never get a box of birth control out the door, right? So I guess it's probably in your detail, and I know it's a big question, so maybe just some examples of how you're measuring the good and how you would be putting some constraints around the spending so it's spent purposefully.
This is a great question, and it's a little bit geeky question, so I love it, but I'm going to keep it shorter. So how do you measure what's the value? For instance, how do you measure the value of saving a human life? There's actually a lot of investigation on how you do that, and a lot of us make implicit valuations of how much we value our own lives by, for instance, deciding to drive a little too fast or cross the road to buy a sneakers, because all of these things have non-zero risk of us dying, right? So we put in some effort to avoid it. For instance, we don't take really dangerous jobs, or if we do, we demand a little extra pay. We can actually find out how much do we value our own lives. Likewise, you can also investigate it by government policy. For instance, how much do you invest in highway safety? We know that the more safety you put in, the fewer people die, but at some point you don't put in more safety because, it's just not worth it. And that's essentially where you see how much do governments evaluate the lives of their citizens. So that's how we evaluate the life side. The other question is, well, but you could spend all the money and do nothing whatsoever. What we try to do is we look at all the different programs that have already been instituted and say, let's assume you do it reasonably well. So reasonably well means you don't just waste it. Obviously, you can spend $1 billion and just do no good. That's very easy to do. Well, actually, that would probably be a little hard to do with $1 billion. But people manage it all the time around the world. But the idea here is to say you do it reasonably well, but it's not absurdly well. So we assume that people are normally incompetent, that they're normally corrupt, that they normally fail, as they have done in many other projects. So we believe that the numbers I just showed you are reasonable estimates of what you could actually get out of $1 or $1 million or $1 billion. But of course, you have to be careful. You can't just go out and buy it from the first person you meet and then expect to get that full effect. But it's a reasonable estimate of what DFAT could do if they did it reasonably well, but still with lots of corruption and all that other stuff that comes with it.
Next question, Nicholas Moore, our chairman.
Thanks, Bjorn, for the presentation. I think it's a brilliant way of looking at the world and the problems. Two questions I have, though, coming out of it. Problems of detail, but the spend on R&D, expecting an outcome. Now, as we know, when we look at the world, you can spend all the money in the world on R&D, and the outcome, of course, is entirely uncertain. And what we've learnt in terms of the Industrial Revolution the big improvements were just little incremental steps that people took along the way to make a final product. So it's quite bold to say you can spend $100 billion on R&D and have this payoff, because it could be entirely wasted. Most R&D, of course, is. So I guess that's one question. And in defence of changing usage, that would result in, say, for example, electric cars or solar cells and all the rest, and the mass production of that we know historically has led with huge economic benefit. So I'd just question whether R&D is really the solution versus mass production and people actually getting out there and competing competitively in a neutral environment. Second question is on contraception, and on that point, looking back at the past in the 60s in terms of the population bomb and the steps taken in India and China in particular, where you had forced sterilisation and abortion and all that dreadful stuff. It's a little bit scary when you talk about contraception, given that history, where the government, again coming back to your previous points, the government sees something like this and think, oh, this is a good thing. Let's put money into this area, with the personal implications being lost in terms of trying to deal with millions of people.
Yeah. All right, so great question. So the first one, obviously, we don't know what the future is going to look like. So yes, this is an absolutely uncertain argument. What we do say is we look at how much have we seen of benefits from other investments in R&D, and then our researchers have tried to translate that into how much of a change in the the probability that we will be able to get, for instance, renewables. So typically you have like a low or zero carbon backup technology that will eventually kick in. So Nordhaus says in 2150, we will have competitive CO2 neutral technologies, even if we don't do anything. So the question is, how much can you move that up? If you look at what we've spent on other things, and we know, for instance, in agricultural research and development, we know fairly well what research and development can drive. Does that mean it has any relation to R&D in green energy? We don't know. We looked across a wide range of areas where governments have spent money and estimated that it will probably be the same kind of benefit back per dollar in those, as it has been in those areas in the past. But we're asking a question about what the future will look like. So no, we don't know. I think it's a reasonable, educated guess, but I would never believe that it's exactly 11. That's no way. On your secondary part of the first question, namely, isn't it much better to just mass produce? Absolutely, we know mass production works, and it can drive down the price. But the point is, then you should make sure you only mass produce one. Say it can reduce the price by half. Then you should only mass produce when solar panels are twice as expensive as they would otherwise be. But unfortunately, I think we started sort of mass producing when they were, 8 times as expensive. Wow, now it's only 4 times or twice. And there's a lot more gradient in that question than I have time to get into. But the whole point is, you need the innovation, and then of course you should utilize the massive benefits you can get from increased production later on. The second part of your question on family planning, absolutely, we're not advocating sterilization or forced or anything. These are 215 million women who say, when you ask them, we would like more access to contraception. So it's only providing them that access. Now, we've actually included, and that goes back to your question, we've included that we know a lot of these women will then try to get the contraception and their husband will say no. So we've included that a lot of this is going to be ineffective, but it's all their own choice. So it's only choice to say, I would actually like to be able to space my next kid so that I can get past the next harvest and that it'll fit better into our timing, and that will actually help. So it's only that part that we've looked at as the benefit.
Next question, Peter Tulip from the Reserve Bank. Just there, Peter, thanks.
To what extent are these alternatives? So I can clearly see that if you're talking about a foreign aid budget, you've got a limited amount you can spend and you have to choose. But if you're talking, say, domestic policy, shouldn't you just do everything with a benefit cost ratio above 1? Or maybe you've got a higher threshold 2 if you're cautious?
Yes. So if this was a question of what should Australia be doing with its own budget, in principle, we should be doing everything that's above 1. And that if you get too many things above 1, it's an indicator that you have too low a discount rate. So absolutely, but the idea in what we're trying to do is basically spending money to do good in the world, because most money that's spent in Australia is spent to do good for Australia. And likewise in the US and everywhere else. They're spent on national priorities. But it's important to emphasize when we talk about climate, which is one of the other things, but also peacekeeping forces, we also have in there some global benefits like oceans and so on. These are typically things we mostly do for other people. We don't do them because cutting a ton of carbon dioxide makes a lot of good for Australia. It makes a little bit of good for Australia, and most of the good will go to everyone else. So in that sense, it's almost the same kind of thing, and that's why we have that conversation. So this is only for what should we be spending money on to do good for the rest of the world. Yes.
Final question, Giles Edward.
Bjorn, I'm kind of dismayed when I look at the...
You what, sorry?
I'm somewhat dismayed when I see that corruption and bribery don't even get a mention except as uncertain. I would have thought that particularly in the poorer countries, Africa, South America, Asia, a lot of what you're saying about delivery of services, health, blah, 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 would be terribly degraded because of the corrupt systems.
Yes.
How do you tackle corruption when it's so endemic in so many societies that you just need a clean sweep or a machine gun or something like that.
Well, all right. I don't think that's the right answer, but let's...
That was a joke for the record, for the record.
So anyway, so it's a very good question. So we work with Susan Rose Ackerman from Yale University, who is actually the originator of, I don't know if you've heard, the estimate that that corruption costs the world $1 trillion a year. So she based on a lot of, obviously it's a very, very, talking about rough estimates, right? But and Mary Hildebrand out of Harvard University, who've also looked a lot on what can you do about corruption in the world. And the simple answer is we don't know. So it's a huge problem, but we don't know how to fix it. And so our argument is, all right, if it's a huge problem, but we don't know how to fix it, tuberculosis is a huge problem. We do know how to fix it. Let's do tuberculosis first. However, it turns out that when we then went to Bangladesh, we actually found that there are specific things that you can do in specific countries. It's not typically about money. So it's not about DFAT giving money to some country to get rid of corruption. In fact, it's probably going to be the other way around, right? But the reality is, in Bangladesh, we actually found, and this is probably true in many countries, so we found that Bangladesh spends a little more than half of its budget on procurement. And procurement obviously is incredibly corrupt. So they have this British system that you have to hand in a sealed envelope with a bid on the public procurement project at a specific government office. But the problem is the ruling elite in this area has already decided that you are going to get the bid, and so what they do is they put up goons outside the office, so you physically can't get in with your envelope. Now, what we found was if you implement e-procurement, so basically put it on essentially eBay, you bid online and you can bid from all across the country. Not only do you get better and higher quality, but you get on average 12% lower cost. We did that because we could do it over 2 years for just a little bit of the budget, and you could go back and say, what did you expect it would cost? And we could actually see what it ended up costing. So we could see that it was these 12%. And what happens then is, if you do this you can get it up to about 95% of the budget, you make $700 million for free every year. Not surprisingly, when we showed this to the finance minister of Bangladesh, this is one of the first things they said, yeah, we're going to do that. And they've now done it mostly, and most of it is good. So again, what has happened here is 12% cheaper doesn't mean that there's no corruption. There's still lots of ways you can do that, but it's 12% less corruption. And that's exactly the kind of solutions that you need. So there are solutions. Unfortunately, there are no good global solutions, and there are no good solutions, as far as we can see, where you spend money to get that. So if you're going to spend $1 million, that's not where you should spend it.
Well, Bjorn has spoken before at the Centre for Independent Studies at our concilium. I think it was in 2012 when we had it at Coolum, until Clive Palmer turned it into a dinosaur park. Well, we haven't been back. But that was in 2012. And I think Bjorn has once again shown why he is widely regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on development and the environment. Please join me in thanking Bjorn Lomborg. Go, mate.